Hello, folks. This is your host, Tammy Tuckey, and you are now listening to the Tiara Talk Show. We bring you rare interviews with the makers of Disney magic. Whether they be singers, actors, Imagineers, animators, they have all made their mark on the Disney name. Be sure to check out the show notes, other episodes, contests, our social media pages from Facebook to Twitter, and more on our official website at www.thetiaratalkshow.com. All guest opinions are theirs and theirs alone and do not represent the opinions of the Tiara Talk Show or the host. The Tiara Talk Show is not associated with the Disney Company. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode. And from all of us here at the Tiara Talk Show, have a hoop-de-doo day. I'm excited to welcome this week's Tiara Talk Show guest, former Imagineer Peggie Fariss, to the show. Welcome, Peggie.
Thank you, Tammy.
It's really great to have you on the show. You know, I was reading a lot about Spaceship Earth, and that's kind of how I came across your name, and I love EPCOT, and I especially love Spaceship Earth, so I'm really excited to be talking with you today. But before we kind of get into, becoming an Imagineer, I thought it would be really interesting to talk about some of your first jobs, and they included working at Disneyland, the main theme park itself. So, what was the inspiration to go ahead and work there?
Well, I grew up in Anaheim, and every birthday, every one of my birthdays, my mother would take my brother and me out of school, and we'd play hooky and we'd go to Disneyland. And so Disneyland was always a really special part of my life. In the summertime, my dad would take us up onto the roof of our house, and we could watch the fireworks from about 6 miles away. So, Disneyland was really special, but I never thought about working there. And then in the summer after I graduated from high school, a good friend of mine said that since I was going to be going to school locally in Fullerton, that I might want to get a job. She'd been working there that summer, and she said, it's really fun, but tell them you want to be a ride operator, which today we call attraction hosts and hostesses. And I reported to casting, and my interviewer, a fellow named Fritz Opel, handed me a script, and it was the narration for Storybook Land. And I read it. Welcome to Storybook Land, everyone. My name is Peggie, and we're on board the Katrina. Together, we're going to relive some of the most famous fairy tales of all time. And he hired me, and I reported the next day. And at that point, I was just really working Friday night, Saturday night, and about 4 hours on Sunday. And it was so much fun. I mean, it didn't really feel like a job. In fact, after I'd been there about 3 months, I got a call from my supervisor, and he called me to his office, and he handed me a stack of paychecks. And he said, payroll would like you to cash these. I really had been working for free. And I thought, this is really terrific. I mean, you get paid for this, and you're working with wonderful people, and you get a chance to visit with guests. And on Storybook Land, you have just maybe a handful of guests, maybe 8 people in a little boat, and you're with them for maybe 10 minutes. And it was lovely, just drifting along the tranquil canal, and being surrounded by miniatures, and so I was having a wonderful time. And then I was actually my supervisor said he'd like to ask me out, but we couldn't date because I was in his area. So he arranged a transfer to the Matterhorn, and that was a much more fast-paced attraction. And then for the next 5 years or so, 5.5 years, I worked at Disneyland. I was part of the opening crew of Tomorrowland in 1967 when we opened the Carousel of Progress, and Monsanto's adventure through inner space, and it was really fun. And then finally I transferred to Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, and had a lovely time there. But in '69, they had taken 10 of us from Disneyland, 10 tour guides and ride operators, to Walt Disney World for the press conference. And in this case, it was for the Walt Disney Productions to announce that they were going to go ahead with Walt Disney's dream for Walt Disney World. And I took a look around this enormous construction site and thought, there are bound to be opportunities for people with Disney experience. So I came back to Disneyland and really started talking to people in earnest about what opportunities there might be in Florida for the opening of Walt Disney World, and found a position with the hotel company. And this was Disney's joint venture with U.S. Steel to build the Contemporary Resort Hotel and the Polynesian Village. And that, again, was sort of the first time Disney extended the themed experience to the guest's entire stay. So rather than just have your themed experience in the park, this was also an opportunity for you to stay in a themed resort and have themed dining and experience recreation that was all themed to the Polynesian Village, the Contemporary Resort Hotel, and we had plans on the drawing board for 3 additional themed hotels at the time. So it got me to Florida in 1971, about 6 months before Walt Disney World opened. And I spent the next 5.5 years there working primarily in convention sales.
With EPCOT, you are a development manager and also an Imagineer on these projects, especially with Spaceship Earth. So,
right. So in 1969, when I was in Florida for the press conference, and we were talking about the first phase of Walt Disney World, the Magic Kingdom and the themed resort hotels and Fort Wilderness campgrounds, and then, EPCOT, we'd all seen the film that Walt Disney had done in 1966, where he talked about EPCOT, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, where people would live a life they couldn't find anywhere else. So that was this big, big idea. But then Walt died. So Roy Disney said, we're going to go ahead with Walt's dream of Walt Disney World. And I think everybody was really comfortable with, we'll do the Magic Kingdom because we know how to do a theme park. We will do these themed resort hotels. It's kind of new to us, but we think we can extend our expertise. And I think the idea of EPCOT was something that that people sort of deferred. Like, how do we get our arms around that? During my time at Walt Disney World, from 1971 for the next 5.5 years, I was learning about how to plan meetings. I was traveling a little bit to represent Walt Disney World to people who were hosting meetings, and I loved it because it really exposed me to all of Walt Disney World, all the operations. You had to know everything from transportation to entertainment to food and beverage. I loved that deep immersion in Walt Disney World, and I also liked the contact we had with the outside world. But I realized I never planned to stay in Florida forever. And I have my family, my mom and dad and my little brother were living back in California. And I started thinking, I'm just a voice on the telephone to my little brother. So I started thinking about what might I be able to do back in California that would let me build on the experiences I'd had at Walt Disney World. And one day I ran into Marty Sklar. And Marty Marty had been playing a really important role within Disney for many, many years. He'd been hired right out of UCLA. He had been editor of the Daily Bruin. He wrote the Disneyland Gazette when he was right out of school. And when I met him in 1969, he was, and he had written everything that Walt Disney said. You know, Marty was really the one who would meet with Walt, and Walt would explain to him what a particular project would be, and then Marty would translate that into press releases and descriptions and even, I think, probably scripts for Walt for television to explain a new concept. So Marty, by that point, was at Walt Disney Imagineering, and he was very senior in the creative organization. And he said, well, you know, Peggie, we are actually planning EPCOT now, and we're thinking about it not as a place where people actually live, but a place that can showcase new ideas, and then people can take those ideas back to wherever it is they live. And, you know, this will begin to inform the shape that the future takes. But unlike the Magic Kingdom or Disneyland, where our subject matter was based more on fantasy or imagination, an adventure, this EPCOT park will be composed of a future world and world showcase. Showcase will represent the culture and architecture and food and of countries around the world, but future world will consist of pavilions dedicated to particular topics that will be important to the future. So we'll have a pavilion of energy. We'll have a pavilion of land and food production. We'll have a pavilion of transportation, a pavilion of communications. And in order for us to really develop the stories for these pavilions, we want to host a series of conferences, and we'll invite people from universities, from business, from the foundations and nonprofits. We'll get the best minds in the country to tell us who's doing important work in these various fields. And so with my meeting planning experience, I was able to transition from Walt Disney World to Walt Disney Imagineering. It was called WED at the time, or Walter Elias Disney. And so I started at Imagineering in 1976, organizing the EPCOT conferences. And then as kind of a spin-off of the conferences, we would identify maybe 6 people. And in those conferences, there would always be some people who were really excited about the project that we were embarking on and wanted to work with us throughout the development process to help make sure that we had access to the best minds, the best people, the best stories. So we formed advisory boards for energy, for the land, for the seas, for space, and we would convene those advisory boards every probably 4 to 6 months, and we would bring them in to Imagineering, and we set up an entire day where we'd meet with the creative teams, and the creative teams would say, here's the work that we've been doing. We think for the land pavilion, we want to tell a story about farming, and we want to tell a story about not only just traditional farming, but some of the really unique things that are going on in the world. And just as an aside, one of the people we met through the course of the advisory boards was a fellow named Carl Hodges from the University of Arizona. And he and his team were doing a lot of work in controlled environment agriculture. And so if you've ever ridden through the land boat ride at EPCOT, so much of that work is really a demonstration of things we observed when we met with Carl and his people. So anyway, I was really busy for the first couple of years doing the EPCOT conferences and the EPCOT advisory boards. And then one day, Marty asked me if I would do the historical research on Spaceship Earth. And Ray Bradbury had given us the story outline and a narration, but we had to figure out, how do we tell the story of 40,000 years of communications history in essentially 17 scenes? So we met with Fred Williams, Dr. Fred Williams, who was dean of the School of Communications, the Annenberg School of Communications at USC. And he and one of his graduate students and I worked together on figuring out what the key scenes should be. And so, for example, we filled a room with 3x5 cards, chronicling everything all the significant developments in communications, in terms of how do we go from speaking to each other to recording information to being able to disseminate that information over great distances. So the story sort of broke down into these dramatic visual scenes, and the first scene, for example, at Spaceship Earth, you board a ride vehicle, a time machine, essentially. In Ray Bradbury's initial narration, he said, it was very poetic. He said, "Who are we? Where have we come from? The answers begin in our past, in the dust from which we were formed, answers recorded on the walls of time. So let us journey into that past." And guests would board their time machine vehicles and travel up into the Spaceship Earth sphere. And the first scene you encounter is of Cro-Magnon cavemen shouting to one another as they try to hunt and bring down this woolly mammoth. And the next scene leads you into a cave. Again, the same fellas, and a shaman and a family sitting in the cave. And you see that there are people recording elements of the hunt on the walls of the cave, and the shaman is telling the story. So we understand that first we talk to each other in order to accomplish big things that we couldn't do alone, and then we convey that story to others who weren't there. So we're sharing information orally, and then we're recording this in pictures on the wall, and that will serve to remind us of that great story and that great accomplishment. It was really extraordinary. We found people who would we found a professor who focused on Egyptian history, and he provided us with the hieroglyphics that line the walls of the temple as you move into the scene. And they actually tell a story. He showed us a letter that Pharaoh had written to one of his administrators, and we had him speak that letter. So when you pass through the scene, the Pharaoh is dictating to a scribe, and he is saying, "Nsut nseshnat sut chati iman hotep ankwaji seneb imiraheut hani jat jat and titima." And we understand from Dr. Degrassi that this is a letter where the Pharaoh is saying, "You're my representative in the field, and I expect you to represent me well." And so, each of those scenes was so much fun. We found a professor I think it was in Minnesota, Dr. Kramelkoff, who, and I had the pleasure of just calling these people out of the blue and saying, "Hello, Dr. Kramelkoff, we understand you speak Phoenician, and I'm from Walt Disney Imagineering, and we're building an attraction, and we want to showcase a Phoenician trader and ship's captain talking about how they're taking the goods to Tarshish. And, we really want to imbue each of these scenes with as much authenticity as we can. And this was sort of a contrast to the approach Imagineering was taking to the World of Motion, the transportation pavilion, because in that case, Ward Kimball was doing a really fanciful, funny take on the development of transportation. And he was just having fun and making things up. And we said, okay, well, we want EPCOT to have variety and a richness, so it doesn't feel like every pavilion is telling the same story in the same tone. So with Spaceship Earth, we really set out to make sure that we could imbue each scene with as much real authenticity as possible.
So what was the thought on the ending scene? Because, we have a lot of progress going on. There's so many new technologies that are out in the world and being developed. And I would only assume that your plan initially, or the entire plan of Spaceship Earth, was maybe to update the ending, kind of like how the Carousel Progress had its last scene. And so how was that aspect taken on?
So a couple of things happened. You're absolutely right, Tammy, that, when you're recounting history, you're on pretty safe ground. I mean, we've made some changes to the attraction over the years, adding elements and switching things out. But a couple of things come into play. So one is you recognize that communications is going to continue to evolve, and the changes may happen very quickly, and who can imagine what they might be. But the other part of it is that physically, you've been traveling up through this sphere. And then you get to the top, and that's the scene where you're out in space looking back at this tiny spaceship Earth, this little blue marble floating in the universe, floating in the vastness of space. And now you have to get back to unload. So, this is where the physical aspects of an attraction and the story aspects of the attraction come together. And I think in this way, we knew that we couldn't build very elaborate sets in the down ramp. And we knew that we wanted to be able to continue to refresh the show. I mean, this is kind of the part that wraps it all up for us. So when I was when I was involved in it, we were looking at external screens that conveyed people from around the world reporting on information. And then I know Larry Gertz was involved in doing the version called Tomorrow's Child. And again, I think we were looking at images on screens that were external to the ride vehicle. By the time we began a partnership with Siemens, we changed the story from just developments in communications to saying that all invention is the result of work that others have done before us, and then we can build on those innovations. And in that case, by the time the creative team was ready to work on what the down ramp story would be, there was technology that enabled us to do touch screens in the ride vehicles, and to be able to engage people in and invite them to create their own futures. You know, in each case, the technology of the time sort of gives us more opportunities to do fun things. So it was challenging and fun, and we came up with lots of really creative ways of representing corporate sponsorship. And then one day the phone rang and they asked me if I'd like to go to Disneyland Paris to lead the Imagineering team. And so that represented my last 5 years with Disney, and that was extraordinary.
getting to be able to talk to you today, Peggy, is really a complete honor. So, and before we end the show, I have 3 Disney-themed questions I always ask my guests. I call them the Fab 3. So we'll start with the Donald question, which is, as a child, what Disney film was one of your favorites to see in the movie theater?
Well, I have a really clear vision of seeing Cinderella in the theater with my parents. So that one is like, that just stands out. I think I was about 3 years old, and I still remember that vividly even today.
And our goofy question, what Disney character do you think you would be best friends with if you got to meet them in person?
I don't know. I saw Zootopia the other day, and I really liked some of the characters in that. So.
And our Mickey question, if I asked you to name any Disney song at this very moment, what immediately comes to mind?
Oh, I love the song from Tangled, where that all at once, they're out on the boat and all those beautiful lanterns are floating up to the sky. I just love that one.
It's a beautiful piece. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Peggy. I really do hope we get to have you back on the show again soon, because, we only got to cover just a small little bit of what you've done for the Walt Disney Company. So thank you again for your time and for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Tammy. It was great talking to you.
Now, without ever leaving their palaces, pharaohs could deliver proclamations and decrees to subjects across the land.